Thank you, Catherine. Shame is both social and biological, leading to the importance of looking at cultural sources when discussing it. Today I will use the Country Girls Trilogy and Epilogue by Edna O'Brien to establish and explore this relationship between shame and culture, specifically in relationship to sexuality, gender, family relations, education, marriage, and the church through O'Brien's characters in their everyday life. Shame is one of the most significant affects, which can make a person feel they are lacking in dignity and worth, and in severe cases, end in suicide. Oh, sorry, my presentation just went away.
It's good to see you.
Let's see.
We can see it, Carleigh.
You can?
Yeah, we can see. What a shame. Your title slide.
Okay.
Try scrolling down. Sometimes I found that that's what I had to do rather than use the directional keys.
I can't see it. I'm going to try to present it a different way really quick so I can move the slides, if that's all right.
No problem.
All right. Can you see that in a second?
You can see something coming now.
It's on its way.
Okay.
That's the title slide. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Sorry about that. All right. Shame is one of the most significant affects, which can make a person feel they're lacking in dignity and worth, and in severe cases, end in suicide. While looking at both shame and shamelessness depicted in O'Brien's novels, represented through her two female protagonists, I make connections to what healing does and does not look like in the realm of shame and its connection to the Catholic Church and Irish literature. Affect theory, founded by Sylvan Tompkins in the 1960s, defines shame as an innate precognitive negative affect, which occurs after the positive affects of joy or interest have been partially depleted. Crucially, what this means is that the source of shame that a person can have is from something they are interested in. If you feel joy or interest from something, and then for whatever reason that joy or interest is partially diminished, you will feel shame. Shame marks us as human. We all blush, but the object, the source of our shame will vary, as will the intensity, varying from a slight blush to total humiliation, mortification, and suicide. Probin tells us that whatever it is that shames you will be something important to you, an essential part of yourself. And if you're interested in and care about the interests of others, you spend much of your life blushing. Conversely, if you don't care, then attempts to shame won't move you. Shame highlights different levels of interest. Shame goes into the heart of who we think we are. In this sense, shame puts one's self-esteem on the line and questions our value system. Often, people use the term shame and guilt interchangeably. However, shame is different from guilt. Shame is much more severe. Guilt is more action-based than shame. We can distinguish the two as guilt being I did something wrong, and shame there is something wrong with me. As we will see, O'Brien's protagonist, Kathleen, because of her gender and position in society, will not have the privilege to defy the prompt to feel shame, and how effective scripts are the ways and patterns of how life's material will be composed. Our early experiences framed by class, race, and gender are reproduced in how we understand possibility and mitigation of shame. O'Brien's work gives us a glimpse at how shame is not only an individual embodied experience, but one rooted in familial and cultural contexts. The interpersonal contexts and those in turn differ from family to family and culture to culture. As we will see, O'Brien's protagonist, Kathleen, because of her gender and position in society, O'Brien's first three novels, The Country Girls, The Lonely Girl, and Girls in Their Married Bliss, placed in a trilogy with an epilogue more than 20 years after their conception, are powerful enough to stand alone but benefit from being read together. Originally written between 1960 and 1964, following the efforts of the Irish state and the Catholic Church to limit women to the domestic sphere, culminating in the 1937 Constitution, which, according to England, underlined women's domestic identity as bearers of children and keepers of the home. In this role, women were expected to ensure the stability of the state, the preservation of the family, and upholding of Catholic values. In 1961, 94.9% of Ireland identified as Roman Catholic, And not only that, White tells us that Ireland in this time was not unusual because of having a large majority of Catholics, but because the large majority were practicing and committed Catholics. The recently published report by the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation wrote, "The Catholic Church did not invent Irish attitudes to prudent marriages or family respectability. However, it reinforced them through church teachings and emphasized the importance of premarital purity and the sexual dangers associated with dance halls, immodest dress, mixed bathing, and other sources of temptation." In the 1920s, the Irish Free State was a newly independent nation, which was determined to show the world that it was different. Part of that difference related to the capacity to withstand the undesirable aspects of modernity, including sexual license and alien cultures. There was a strong alignment of views between church and state, resulting in legislation against contraception, divorce, censorship of cinema and publications that was bolstered by the church sermons denouncing sexual immorality and the evils of modern society. In the 1960s, with increased access to birth control, divorce, and greater independence, women would begin to undermine traditional gender relations. The Country Girls is the first of a trilogy that will give voice to much of the greater independence women were feeling as the 1960s went on, but also the shame felt by them as they undermined these traditional gender relations in Ireland. Consequently, O'Brien's books were censored as obscene, labeled a smear on womanhood, and she was publicly denounced by Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, while the local priest held a book burning of her novel. O'Leary claims we find it harmless 60 years on, but when it was first published, the protagonist's sexuality and irreverence were considered a risk to public morality. O'Brien was immediately accused of bringing shame on Irish women. However, we can see now that O'Brien gives voice to the female shame of a generation that needed to be heard, rather than bringing shame upon them. As Marilyn Mason reminds us that shame is systemic, and she calls for attention to be paid for the overpowering and typically overlooked cultural context of shame. It is on this note that we will begin to look at the Country Girls trilogy and epilogue. O'Brien stated that she, quote, decided to have two protagonists for the trilogy. One, Kathleen, who would conform to both my own and my country's view of what an Irish woman should be, and one, Baba, who would undermine every piece of protocol and religion and hypocrisy there was, end quote. I assert that in this way, Kathleen represents shame and Baba shamelessness. Not only that, we follow Kathleen, the supposed ideal of Irish Catholic girlhood, as she develops in this trilogy into a woman who suffers from chronic internalized shame, which leads to her distressing life and unfortunate death. In the first novel, A Buildings Romance set in mid-century Western rural Ireland, we follow Kathleen through a childhood shaped by shame, which inevitably leads to a life of internalized shame. In a patriarchal society driven by the concept of the nuclear family and women as the bearers of national identity and virtue, Kathleen is subjected to repeated beatings by her drunken father and the eventual death of her dear, loving martyr of a mother. The repeated scenes that Kathleen experiences, which involve shame, will rule the rest of her life, as they will form a script which will dictate how she responds to situations in the future, caused by body issues, peers, intimate relationships, especially with foreign older married men, and nuns during the time at her convent. The second novel is set in Dublin and focuses primarily on Baba and Kathleen's adaptation to life on their own in a large city and the romantic attachments they form. Kathleen struggles with her morality, even without the physical interference from her father, as she continues to hear her dead mother's voice condemning her for the vices she has developed while living in Dublin, where she has stopped going to Mass. Baba continues to be her friend, roommate, and enemy, whose brazen shamelessness in regard to drinking and men seems to only add to the shame experienced by the already shame-prone Kathleen, who is now not only experiencing her own shame about her new lifestyle in the city, but secondhand shame from Baba. Kathleen develops her second relationship with a married older foreigner and begins to go by the name Kate, an anglicized version of her name because her lover, Eugene, finds Kathleen too Kiltartan. This is the beginning of the contempt and resentment Eugene has for Kathleen, which will develop into the next novel and culminates in his eventual taking away of their child. We can see that the relationships Kathleen forms are not healthy and are based on her desire to fill what her father cannot, a healthy interpersonal bond. Kathleen belongs to a socialization process that continues through adolescence, where women learn to define their self-identity through a relationship to a man, not surprising in mid-century Ireland. Kathleen feels unlovable and inferior because of her internalized shame, and this pattern repeats in her search for love. The third novel, ironically named Girls in Their Married Bliss, is told to us from Baba's perspective rather than Kathleen's, as if Kathleen's perspective is too shameful to recount, as she hides from the affect which revolves around the fear of being seen as inferior and lesser than by the other. Baba is now our narrator because she was always the one who did not care what the Catholic Church and society thought, and so continues the story for us. Kathleen's life does not improve in this novel. Once in London, Kathleen finds herself pregnant outside of wedlock. Despite divorcing his American wife and marrying her, Kathleen repeats her pattern for searching for love in inappropriate places. Though she never physically cheats, Eugene takes away their only child and divorces her in a very calculated and cruel manner. Separated from her only child, another breaking of the interpersonal bridge, she decides to sterilize herself, permanently separating herself from the Irish Catholic female ideal of motherhood, as she feels she is no longer worthy of being a mother. At this point, Eugene clearly illustrates his contempt for Kathleen, and as Wormser states, contempt by others is a type of aggression that degrades the individual's value by equating her with a debased, dirty thing, a derided and low animal. Not only is she being shamed by her husband, she also feels shame at the thought of her failing relationship with her husband. And although the masculine characters are negatively portrayed in much of O'Brien's work, Brooks Hughes tells us that it is usually the women who are punished, and writes about the abuse and misogyny which are internalized in O'Brien's women and converted into self-hatred, specifically hatred of the gendered body. And the shame that has been internalized as well in Kathleen's case leads to her sterilization. Kathleen is attempting to take away her shame of being a failed wife and mother, and her self-contempt. In severe shaming situations, one no longer wishes to explore and take interest in the world, as they feel defected, making them feel that they are unlovable and not deserving of love and unworthy of a place in society. Kathleen's response to shame is to completely degrade herself and feel inferior, and we could identify that she has now developed an internalized shame script that is growing because of these repeated scenes of shame. When the severity of shame in a person leaves them feeling self-contempt, the resulting feeling can be that they would like to get rid of or remove part of themselves they hate, represented by her sterilization, which in turn could lead them to becoming suicidal. O'Brien wrote the epilogue in 1986 because she had left Baba and Kathleen suspended, thinking that, quote, they could stay young indefinitely, or their mistakes might be canceled out, or that they would achieve that much touted fallacy, rebirth, end quote. She knew that she needed to write the epilogue because Baba's asperity had to prevail, yet Kathleen does not survive. Baba, again our narrator, tells us of Kathleen's death and the 20 years that have passed since the last novel. We learn that Kathleen died by accidental drowning at a health facility she had gone to. Her son has left her again after she regained custody in a court trial and gone to university in America. The last time Baba saw Kathleen, she was again in love with a married man who told her that he could not leave his family for her. And she told Baba, quote, if I get through this, I'm all right, Kate said. Through what? Baba said. This last big breach, Kate said, and Baba went cold because she sensed something calamitous. Kate put her hand to her heart and said she'd like to tear it out, stamp on it, squash it to death, her heart being her undoing, end quote. Her heart was not her undoing, but her shame was. After repeated ruptures of relationships, constant shaming at the hands of her friends, kin, countrymen, and husband, she could no longer handle life. As Baba says, quote, I don't blame her. I realized she was in the effing wilderness, born there, hadn't the reins to haul herself out, end quote. Brian claims that in spite of Baba's less than happy marriage, she survives in part because she is the heroine who understands every piece of protocol and religion and hypocrisy that there ever was. Baba is critical of the church to the end, discussing its stance on motherhood and contraception as she relays her only friend's tragic ending. Baba's shamelessness was her savior, while Kathleen's shame was her undoing. Andrew P. Morrison wrote that a synonym often used for shame is mortification, which gestures towards its lethal quality, and the words invocation of death. To feel mortified is to feel self-destructive to the point of being suicidal. If, like Kathleen, a person comes to the point where there is no place left to hide from shame, the contempt they feel becomes lethal and they choose to erase themselves. Nunez writes, not unlike the sterilization that prefigures it, suicide, as she reasons, is the only means by which she can simultaneously satisfy all elements of the contradictory demands upon her. When she succeeds later in achieving her own death by drowning, she essentially metes out her own punishment, performing the ultimate act of submission and the ultimate act of penitence for that submission, end quote. When shame is no longer used as a chance to reevaluate the self and do good, but is instead an internalized chronic condition, which after repeated scenes of shame for the entire life, it will lead to self-contempt and suicide. Jennifer Jacquet wrote about using shame as a powerful tool, but only when it matches certain specifications and is used correctly, as it can also be dangerous. Shame is attached to societal norms, just as we discussed how it is irrevocably connected to interest, we use shame as a tool to enforce the norms we see as acceptable in society. Because shame is attached to societal norms, Jacquette states this is the reason we should not blame shame, the emotion or the act of shaming, for making us uncomfortable if what we actually disagree with is the norm that shame is attempting to enforce. We must consider when looking at cases such as Kathleen, whether her transgressions against norms, having sex before marriage, disobeying her father's wishes as an adult, divorcing, not going to mass, etc., are transgressions which require shame, or shame to the extent that leads to humiliation. Acceptable shaming also tends to focus on the powerful over the marginalized. A shaming campaign that further ostracizes the people already most ostracized by society, or further stigmatizes the most stigmatized, will be less defensible. Kathleen, as a female in 20th century Ireland, was not the powerful, which further led to her shaming experience to leave her with the feelings of mortification and ostracization from society. When shaming goes into the realm of humiliation, as in the case of branding, dunce caps, and scarlet letters, which are unsurprisingly no longer acceptable, shame is no longer being used for good. When shame is not used incorrectly, Jacquette believes it can be amended through apologizing, as apologies are part of the post-shaming healing process, both for the transgressor and for the crowd. Unfortunately, this did not happen in Kathleen's situation. Edna O'Brien's narrative gives testimony to the female shame pervading the culture of Ireland in the 20th century. There is shame about shame, and it can be a painful thing to write about, but it is through the narration, articulation, and recognition of shame that we can process it, be free from its negative aspects, and some argue heal it. By confronting issues such as marriage, sexuality, family, education, religion, and motherhood in the trilogy, O'Brien offered us a shame narrative. Just as Weston argues that in the Country Girls trilogy, trauma is not purely the matter of the psychological damage of one individual, Kathleen's traumas are Ireland's traumas. I argue that Kathleen's shame is Ireland's shame. We have seen how O'Brien created two protagonists who gave a voice to a generation of women who were previously muzzled, and as McBride wrote, quote, into bodies raised to the expectation of violence, rape, forced pregnancy, and numerous dangerous childbirths, domestic bondage, and the ever-present risk of institutionalization for intentionally or unintentionally bringing shame on male relations, O'Brien breathed the radical oxygen of choice, desire, and sensual delight, end quote. Crucially, Probin tells us that ideas in writing about shame seek to generate new ways of thinking about how we are related to history and how we wish to live in the present. And hopefully, in this way, the fictional death of Kathleen will help us reflect on how we wish to live in the present in relationship to our culture and faith, and what societal norms need to be enforced and to what degree.
Thank you, Carleigh. Another working paper. I'm going to, I've got